We are honored to introduce you to Rob Schwartz, author of Your Soul's Plan and Your Soul's Gift, and he's a Between Lives soul regression therapist. I know this conversation is absolutely on purpose, and we planned it before we even came to Earth. But we'll get into that later. I do want to share, though, how I came to read and be transformed by Rob's first book, Your Soul's Plan. Several years ago, I was talking to my friend, Spiritual Medium Lisa Nitzkin. I was in the beginning of my own spiritual awakening, and I was telling her that when I would talk to others about what was going on with me, and how, in my opinion, everything happens on purpose, people would say, well, why then is there so much death, destruction, and atrocities in our world? And why would so many of us experience such tragedy or difficulties in our lives? And Lisa said, you need to tell them to read Your Soul's Plan by Rob Schwartz, and you should read it as well. It will help to make sense of the senseless. And so I did, and here we are.
And I don't think it's any coincidence that Your Soul's Plan is also one of my favorite all-time books and literally changed the way I look at my own life. The way Robert sheds a completely new light on how loss, addiction, physical ailments, some of the most seemingly tragic and unexplainable events can be understood as our soul's life lessons that we choose before we're born. For me, this is an entirely inspiring and empowering way to find purpose and why some of the things that happen in our lives come to us because we ourselves have planned out our life school.
Rob's book truly changed the way I look at every experience in my life and how I look at other people's lives as well. Rob's approach helps all of us see the purpose in our pain and in our joys as a way of using our life experiences to help us advance our soul's journey. If you are someone who asks why or what is the meaning of your life, Rob's perspective may be just what you need to hear. Rob, we'd love to hear about your story and your spiritual awakening. And how did it all begin? I know that right before we started, you were telling me that actually it happened in Evanston, which is not far from where I live. And so we'd love to hear more.
Well, let me just begin by thanking you for having me on the show. I appreciate that. And I'd like to mention my website is yoursoulsplan.com. And if people go there, they can read large portions of Your Soul's Plan and Your Soul's Gift for free. You're correct. It started in Evanston, Illinois. I was self-employed as a marketing and communications consultant, basically doing different forms of corporate writing, which I found to be tremendously unfulfilling. I was casting about trying to figure out what I should really be doing with my life because I knew it wasn't that kind of work. And I tried different things that really did not shed any light on the matter. I went for career counseling and did the Myers-Briggs and asked friends and family, what should I do? And none of that really helped at all. And so I thought to myself, okay, I've got to think outside the box here. What can I do to figure out my soul's plan, so to speak? And this idea came to me, go see a psychic medium. Now, I come from a very conventional background. Mediumship is not part of that background. I wasn't even sure if I believed in mediumship, but I thought, why not? I'll invest an hour of my time and a little bit of money. And so I did that on May 7 of 2003 in Evanston, Illinois. I had my first session ever with a psychic medium. She starts the session by introducing me to the concept of spirit guides, which I had never even heard of at that time. And she explained that a guide is a highly evolved non-physical being with whom we plan our lives before birth and who guides us through our lives after we get here. And through this particular medium, I was actually able to talk to my guides that day. Now, they said a lot of amazing things, one of which was they said, you planned your life, including your biggest challenges, before you were born. And I'll tell you, I just shook my head and I said, well, why in the world would I have done that? And they said, you did this for purposes of spiritual growth. Now, again, coming as I did from such a conventional background, I probably would have dismissed all of this as some kind of delusion on my part, except that the guides then launched into this very detailed explanation of what my challenges had been and why I had planned them before I was born. Now, mind you, I had not told them anything about myself, nor had I told the medium anything before the session. So they start going through my challenges one by one. They know what all of them are. And they give me this detailed explanation as to why I planned each one of them. Well, this just rocked my world, so to speak. I mean, it changed everything. I was stunned. I came out of that session just dazed. I didn't know what to make of it. Over the next couple of weeks, something quite profound happened, which is by thinking about this pre-birth planning perspective and all the information they had given me, I was able to see for the first time in my life deeper meaning to many of the challenges. And that created a very deep healing for me. So it was at that point I thought, all right, if this kind of perspective can create this kind of healing for me, then surely it can create that kind of healing for other people. And that was when I first started to think about writing a book about how we plan our lives before we're born. And then a number of other things happened, and one thing led to another. And a few years later, I came out with Your Soul's Plan, and then a few years after that, Your Soul's Gift. But that experience with the medium, along with a couple other things, was absolutely pivotal in getting me to be able to write those books.
Wow. And one question I have too, just getting to that point where you said you went to the medium, I know with our own experiences, you get to this point of being at a crossroads, right? And I know for you said you were working in marketing communications and it wasn't maybe as fulfilling as you thought it would be. Did you kind of have this nagging that you had to do something?
I did. That was a very good way to describe it. It was quite clear to me that I was not doing what I came to Earth to do, and that there was some specific thing I was supposed to be doing, but I didn't know what it was, and I wasn't even sure how to figure out what it was. But that session with the medium, that really launched me on the path to figuring it out.
That session with that medium was so planned. I think from reading your book, that's what I would assume.
I would assume that too. I didn't specifically ask them that question, but I think it's very likely that that was planned by me and by the medium before either one of us was born.
They gave you a lot of information in that one session. So when you walked out, how did you process and believe?
The Spirit laid the groundwork for that session starting several years earlier. When I was in my early 30s, I started reading books about near-death experiences. And I am absolutely certain that it was my guides who directed me to those books, even though at the time I didn't know what a spirit guide was. And so I read these accounts over and over again over a period of years. And so by the time I got to the session with the medium, the ground had been laid, so to speak, for this to take root.
That helps a lot, because I think some people, had they never read anything or heard anything like that, they may not have taken it as seriously.
There was a part of my mind that was saying, this is crazy. What are we doing here? Let's get out of here. But I just figure that's the ego. I'll ignore the ego, and I'm going to listen to what they're saying.
Well, and they spoke to your soul, right? It's something that when you know it's true, you can feel that it's true. But for me, I think what was so mind-boggling about what you were saying and that was so different about what I had learned. I had been so focused on past life regressions, right? Like looking at what did our past life teach us versus taking that very precious moment before we're born to think about, gosh, I really came here with an intention. Can you just talk about what that pre-birth land looks like and what it looked like for you, Robert?
So I should explain here, the way I researched people's pre-birth plans for my 2 books was by working with mediums and channels who can access that kind of information. Now I'm a hypnotist. I do between lives regressions myself. And I think that's probably the most powerful and direct way to get that kind of information. So in the sessions with the mediums and the channels, I had some opportunity to ask personal questions. And what they told me was that I had 2 past lives in which they said you knew the truth, but you didn't have the courage to act on it. One was apparently in Atlantis, where the government was doing all sorts of horrible things. And I was there. I was an Atlantean citizen. I was opposed to what the government was doing, but I didn't have the courage to do anything about it. And then apparently there was another lifetime just like that in Nazi Germany. I was a German citizen who was opposed to what the Nazis were doing, but I didn't have the courage to do anything about it. And so they said, when you reviewed those 2 lives, you decided you wanted to learn the lesson of speaking your truth courageously. And that this was one of the reasons I chose this particular mission, because pre-birth planning is not yet in the mainstream. It would take some courage to put it out there. And that apparently was the lesson and the experience that I wanted to have.
I have the chills. Thank you for sharing. And thank you for being brave enough and having the courage in this lifetime. Had you heard that term at all prior to that medium reading?
I had not heard that term previously. There's a misconception about that term. A lot of people, when they hear the term pre-birth planning, they actually think that refers to the planning a couple does when a woman is pregnant. And yes, that is a form of pre-birth planning, but that's not the kind that I'm writing about.
Can you talk a little bit more about what your definition of pre-birth planning is?
Pre-birth planning for me is literally the planning you do before you come into body that lays out the course of your life. Now, that does not mean that everything is set in stone. That isn't what planning means here. It means, for the most part, that you set up what you want to experience as a set of possibilities or probabilities, and which ones actualize depends upon your free will decisions. Basically, to put it in simple terms, the more you make love-based decisions, the less you need the life challenges to awaken you, The more you make fear-based decisions, the more you call the challenges to yourself. And I don't want people to go into fear when they hear that. That's actually the opposite of what I want. But just be aware that in general, that is how it works. So in the pre-birth planning session, you talk with your spirit guides, ascended masters who may be participating. God or source plays a role. Your higher self plays a crucial role. It orchestrates and oversees the entire process. And you come up with a plan that will allow you, hopefully, to learn what you want to learn. But whether or not you learn those lessons is a matter of free will. You can always turn away from the plan and go off and do fear-based, ego-based things. But then most likely when you have your life review, you're going to see that you didn't learn what you came here to learn, and you're planning another life to give yourself the same opportunity.
It's like the whole idea of karma, right? It's not like you're being punished for anything that you did wrong. It's just that every time you come in, you have that opportunity to say, this is the lesson I want to learn. And then when you get here, unfortunately, you forget that that's what you set up for yourself. But your soul, I think, always knows.
Our audience, they're really made up of beginner seekers. They're open, but they're still learning a lot of terminology and these concepts. So before we jump into, which I know we're so excited about, talking about these examples and what you have studied in your book and even your process, some of the terms you just mentioned, ascended masters, higher self. Can you explain how that works in this hierarchy of spirit in your belief?
In my belief system, and I should say the reason I have this belief system is because of all the information I collected in the sessions with the mediums and channels for the books, and now in literally hundreds of between lives regressions in which the client talks directly to spirit in a trance state. My understanding of the so-called spiritual hierarchy, it's based on vibration or frequency. You know, we live in a universe that is energy. Everything is energy vibrating to a certain frequency. And as you go up the spiritual hierarchy, in other words, as beings become more wise and more loving, and especially unconditionally loving, their vibration goes up. So you have human beings who are in the third dimension in a physical body at a relatively low or dense vibration. And then you have a whole host of non-physical beings who are working with us, spirit guides who are at many different levels of vibration. And then you have angels who are at a very high non-physical vibration. An ascended master is a being who has mastered unconditional love and graduated from the earth plane at a very, very high frequency. The soul itself is at what you could call an ultra elevated frequency, very, very high. And then the highest, of course, would be God or source or whatever term you want to use. And nowadays, a lot of people use the word source because God has so many religious connotations. But in my mind, God and source are the same, and soul and higher self are the same.
And you do such a great job of explaining that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the book itself and some of the research that you did and some of the stories that what you feel were the aha moments for you and some of those experiences that they planned in this lifetime.
Yeah, and the process that's part of that to get to those stories.
So the process for researching Your Soul's Plan and Your Soul's Gift is that I interviewed somebody about a very common life challenge. And it's all the most common things we face here because I wanted the books to help as many people as possible. So between the two books, there are chapters on pretty much every common life challenge: physical illness, mental illness, difficult relationships, financial challenges, deafness and blindness, adoption, miscarriage and abortion, drug addiction, alcoholism, and on and on and on. And the person I interviewed for a particular chapter would have 1, 2, or sometimes 3 sessions with the mediums in which we asked Spirit, did this person plan this experience before he or she was born, and if so, why? And then in the books, I present all the information that came through. And there's so many stories to choose from, I don't know who you would most like to hear about. The most dramatic story is toward the end of the first book, Your Soul's Plan. There's a chapter on accidents, which are not really accidents. And one of the stories in that chapter is a woman who's blown up in a bomb explosion. And we work with a medium who has the ability to hear the conversations we had with each other in the pre-birth planning sessions. So she goes into this woman's pre-birth planning session, and we could actually hear the conversation she had with the soul who eventually planted the bomb. And they're talking about this. She's agreeing to be at the effects of the bomb. And the reason she wants to have this seemingly horrible experience is because she wanted to be a great healer in this lifetime. And she knew before she came into body that if she could heal herself from the devastating effects of that bomb explosion, she could then take all of that wisdom and knowledge about healing and turn it outward in service to others. And that's exactly what she did. Her recovery took 2 years and 10 reconstructive surgeries. But when it was over, she went back to school. She got a PhD in speech language pathology, set up a private practice, and at this point in her career has healed literally thousands of people. What makes her story so amazing is the level of suffering she went through, and then how she used an awareness of her pre-birth plan to forgive and actually get to a place of gratitude. So when that bomb exploded, the flames scorched her entire body from head to toe. 2 fingers were severed, both eardrums were ruptured. When she got to the hospital, doctors actually had to hold magnets over her eyeballs to extract the shrapnel from the pipe. So we're talking here about a level of suffering that's almost unimaginable to you and me. Well, during that 2-year period when she was having the 10 reconstructive surgeries, there was a day when she was lying in her hospital bed in a lot of pain. And all of a sudden she heard this voice inside her head talking to her. It was not her own voice. And the voice said, "You planned this." And of course she said, "Why?" And then the voice said, "You knew before you were born that if you could heal yourself from this, you could go on to be a gifted healer." Now, it's not like she got immediately to a place of forgiveness or gratitude or acceptance in that moment. It took a while. It turns out that that voice is one of her guides, and she started to talk to the guide regularly. And over a period of time, as she learned more and more about her pre-birth intentions, she was able to forgive the bomber and then actually get to a place where she was grateful for the experience. And to me, this is one of the most powerful stories I've seen that shows what you can do with an awareness of your pre-birth plan. She could have chosen instead to be angry for the rest of her life. She could have chosen to be bitter and resentful for the rest of her life. She might even have decided to track down the bomber and try to take revenge. But because she came into this understanding of her pre-birth plan and really worked with it over a period of years, she got to a place of total forgiveness and then to a place of total gratitude. Now her story is unusual in that it's a bomb explosion, but she herself is not unusual. She's just like you and me and everybody who will hear this conversation. So if she can use an awareness of her pre-birth plan to forgive and get to a place of gratitude after what she went through, then all of us can do the same thing using an awareness of our pre-birth plan.
I know that story really stuck with me when I read it. I think the other part too was you also talk about the bomber, because they think the other part is that that bomber chose to be the bomber in this lifetime. I know with conversations with my own friends about it, we always come back to that story because there's somebody who has to play that other role too. Can you talk a little bit about some of the information that came through about the bomber?
Yeah, the bomber apparently had at least one past life in, I believe it was Northern England or Ireland. Something to do with bombings in the past life, was a political activist of some kind. And he never really healed this sort of anger and wounding that led him to use bombs in past life. And so this is something that is very common. What you don't heal in a past life, you often choose to carry back into body energetically in another lifetime, not for the purpose of expressing it, but rather for the purpose of healing it. So the bomber talks about how he's going to carry these unhealed energies back into body. His hope is that he will find a way to heal them, but he knows that if he doesn't find a way to heal them, he's likely to plant at least one other bomb and do the whole thing over again. And so her response to this in the pre-birth planning session is, I'm on board with that, because if you succeed in healing yourself and you don't plant the bomb, then there will be something else I built into my life plan, another accident that gives me the same opportunity to become a great healer. And if you do plant the bomb and I'm at the effects of the bomb, then I will work with that again to become a powerful healer. So either way, no matter which direction he goes with it, she's fine with that plan. And that was their agreement.
Puts a new light on loving your enemies, doesn't it?
It really does. I always think in my own life, my biggest challenges and my biggest challengers are my greatest teachers. Somehow we did plan that, whatever it is, that's how I look at it. And it's because of your work.
Do you find, Robert, that when people go through these experiences that they are able to forgive those in their lives that have seemingly wronged them in some way?
It's a big help. It's not guaranteed that if you understand your pre-birth plan, you will get to a place of forgiveness. It helps tremendously with relatively small violations and moderate violations. If something really traumatic, something really severe has happened, then the understanding of the pre-birth planning is a wonderful foundation to build on, but there's usually some additional forgiveness work that you have to do on top of that. There are two individuals who have actually developed methodologies to get yourself to a place of forgiveness. One is Colin Tipping with the radical forgiveness work that you might have heard of. And there's another person, Fred Luskin, who used to be the director of the Forgiveness Institute at Stanford. He wrote an excellent book called Forgive for Good. Both systems are outstanding. It would not make sense to do both. I think that would be confusing and redundant. Read up on the two systems and then choose the one that most resonates with you. You really can't go wrong with either one.
And then also with some of those other challenges that you talked about, adoption, drug addiction, relationships, coming in with some sort of disability. One of the things that I know I learned through it, because people had planned it, it was to learn things like compassion or empathy. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the main reasons people plan big challenges before they come into body is healing energies from past lives. In Your Soul's Plan, in the Deafness and Blindness chapter, the deafness story is a young African-American woman named Penelope. She was born completely deaf in both ears. So we did a session with the medium who hears the conversations in the pre-birth planning sessions. Now, because of Penelope's deafness, the whole session was done on instant messenger. Each one of us was in our home typing on the computer. But the medium goes into Penelope's pre-birth planning session, and we hear the conversation she had with her guide when the deafness was planned. And what we discover is that in the life immediately prior to this one, Penelope had the same mother she has in this lifetime. And in that past life, when she was a little girl, she heard her mother shot to death by the mother's boyfriend. Now, she didn't actually see the murder, but she heard the gunshots that led to her mother's death. As you can imagine, she was quite traumatized by that, so much so that it actually led her to commit suicide in that lifetime. So she returned to spirit from that life with what you could call an energy of unhealed trauma, which now needs to be healed. In the pre-birth planning session, her spirit guide says to her, "My dear, would you prefer to be born deaf so that no similar trauma will happen to you again, and so that you can complete your healing from the last lifetime?" And she responds, "Yes, that is what I want and what I wish to do." And then what follows is this fascinating dialogue in which she and her guide work out the details of the deafness. An important point to get here is that the decision to be female, African American, and completely deaf is not random or arbitrary in any way. One of her pre-birth intentions was to deepen in compassion, and she thought that this relatively unusual combination would put her in a lot of situations that would provide both the opportunity and the motivation to cultivate compassion. Well, that's exactly what happened, and now she offers that compassion to her students in the deaf community. She's a teacher to the deaf, and that's usually the other half of the pre-birth plan. The first portion of it is cultivate virtues like compassion, usually through challenges. The next portion of the life plan is take the virtues you've cultivated and offer them to others in some form of service.
It's phenomenal.
Can you just talk a little bit about the process when someone comes to see you and how it all works?
What I do as a hypnotist is something called a between lives soul regression, or BLSR for short. It's the same thing as what is sometimes called a life between lives regression. That's what Michael Newton, the person who founded the field of between lives regression, called it when he started it back in the 1990s, but it's the same thing. So what happens in a BLSR, we start with a series of physical and mental relaxation steps, and then I guide you into a past life. It's almost always a past life that had a big impact on the plan for the current lifetime. So you see several different scenes in the past life, the last one of which is the death scene. You leave the body in the death scene and cross back over to the other side, which I realize sounds a little bit ominous, but there's actually nothing to it. It's very easy and safe and natural and gentle. When you get to the other side, usually you're greeted by a spirit guide, although it could be a deceased loved one, an angel, a master. Some people are greeted by Jesus or Buddha, for example. But whoever greets you, you ask them why you were shown that particular past life, why it's important for you to know about it at this time, and how it affected the plan for the current lifetime. And then you ask whoever it is you're talking with to take you to the Council of Elders. These are the very wise, loving, and highly evolved beings who oversee reincarnation on Earth. And they know everything about you, both the plan for your current current lifetime and every past life you've had. So when you get in front of the council, you can ask literally any question on any subject, and if it's for your highest good to know the answer, the council will answer. The questions people ask most often are, what did I plan? Why did I make those plans? How am I doing in terms of fulfilling my plan? And how can I better fulfill my plan? But they will answer anything you put to them as long as it's for your highest good to know the answer. The two comments people make most often after they talk to the council, they will say things like, I could feel the council's tremendous unconditional love for me, and I could also sense that they knew literally everything about me, including all the bad things I've done in my life, and yet they had absolutely no judgment of me. And for most people, this is the first time since coming into body that they've experienced that kind of unconditional love. That's what the other side is like. That's what our home is like. But to have that experience while you're here in body is an incredibly profound awakening experience. And people will come out of that session and they'll say things like, they answered every question I asked. I have no more questions about my life. And then they can go about learning the underlying lessons in a more conscious and presumably much less painful manner.
Well, and I think about the fact that you research this and now you do it yourself, and you've done hundreds of these. Everybody has a spirit guide and everybody is able to go and talk to the Council of Elders. People always are talking about having the same kinds of experiences in terms of how this plays out. That's what I hope people listening or watching can understand.
There are some people who do not go into trance, and that's true for everybody who practices hypnosis. If you ever talk to a hypnotist who says they have a 100% success rate, don't work with that person because they're not telling you the truth. Mm-hmm. Now, the odds are very much in your favor, and I do something that I think increases the chances of going into trance, which is I send every client a recording. It's me talking for about 20 minutes in a guided meditation, and I tell people, practice relaxing to the sound of my voice at least 10 times prior to your session. Now, not everybody follows that suggestion, but if you do, it greatly increases your chances of going into trance, which are pretty good to begin with. So the odds are very much in your favor.
One question I have too about the way that you do your hypnosis is, do people remember what they felt or what they saw?
For the most part, they remember the feeling. That will stay with them their whole lives. And they will remember almost all of the details of what happens. I record the interactive portion of every Between Lives regression. So you've got a recording of it to refer back to.
What part are you hearing? What part are you not hearing? And how do you guide the questions for them to ask?
So I myself am not a medium or a channel. It's very clear to me when I write or when I do workshops that there's a non-physical team assisting me, but it's not that I'm hearing them talk to me in my mind. I just feel their presence and a sense of inspiration coming from them. Before every client does a Between Lives regression, I have them fill out an extensive intake form. And one of the main purposes of the form is for them to put their questions for the council so they don't have to remember them during the session. Then when they get to the council, I ask them to speak out loud everything they're hearing from the council. So I'll prompt them to ask every question that's on the intake form, and then they will tell me word for word what the council's response is so that we can get it on the recording.
Wow. Do they see things as well in their mind's eye? Are they getting a visual representation of what their spirit guides or the council looks like?
The vast majority of people do. There are different modes of communication with spirit, and usually each person has a primary mode. So the four main modes are visual, auditory, feelings or emotions, and what I call knowings without knowing how you know. In other words, you don't see or hear anything, but you get instantaneous downloads of information to every question you ask. So it can be any one of the four, any combination of the four. Visual is probably the most common, along with auditory. They see all kinds of things. I mean, they will see not only the council, usually there are a number of non-physical beings who are in attendance simply to watch their meeting with the council. So when they get there, I say, look around in all directions, what do you see? And very often they'll say, oh, there's my uncle, my aunt, my grandparents, they're all here. They're here to listen to the conversation with the council.
Wow, that's amazing.
It really is.
Do you see similarities in like where they are and where the council is? Is there a similar environment that they're all in?
There is variability in that, but generally people see a very spacious room, and they will see council in humanoid form, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes androgynous, some combination thereof. Generally the council is seated at what appears to be a very long table. Now, sometimes clients see the council members as just light, sort of balls or spheres of light. They're actually floating or suspended in air. Generally, that's what they report.
When you talk about that there are people that may look familiar to them, would you say that those are part of their soul tribe?
I don't use the word tribe. I use the phrase soul group.
Soul group.
I think it's the same thing.
Yes.
A soul group is a collection of souls who are more or less the same vibration, which is another way of saying the same stage of evolution. And you and the other members of your soul group have many, many incarnations with each other in which you play every conceivable role for each other. So you and the other members of your group will be mother and daughter, father and son, brother and sister, best of friends, mortal enemies, and every other role you can think of. At the soul level, there's no judgment of any of these roles, even when they're quote unquote negative roles. They're just roles that are scripted. We're all players on a stage, like Shakespeare said, and we're playing these parts for each other so that we can stimulate each other's learning and growth and healing and evolution.
Thank you for explaining that.
One question that Robyn and I talk about a lot is, do we have opportunities to leave this lifetime? Do we plan those as well?
That is planned. It's what is sometimes referred to as an exit point. And you plan multiple exit points across the lifespan. You would take an exit point under one of two circumstances. Either you've learned and done everything you came here to learn and do, or your soul concludes that for whatever reason you will not be able to learn what you came here to learn. And in either one of those two situations, you take an exit point, it's time to go home. There are some exceptions to that. Sometimes somebody will complete whatever learning they plan for the lifetime, but they stick around to be of service to the other significant people in their lives. But that's basically how exit points work.
Well, and then also that makes me want to ask you about challenges that may not be planned that come up in your lifetime. What are some examples of those, or how would that come about?
Well, the challenges that are not planned are the same challenges that are planned. In the channeling sessions for the books, I often asked, what percentage of the time is this particular experience planned before birth? And there was some variability in the response, but it generally came in around 70%. So that's still leaving a significant chunk of experience that is not planned. And that's why coming to Earth takes so much courage, because no matter how much you plan out your life, there's still a lot that's going to happen that was not planned.
Yeah.
Can I just throw in a question about suicide and people's choice to leave the body? How is that dealt with when they return to the other side and are reviewing their life? How are they evaluated after a suicide?
So in my second book, Your Soul's Gift, there's actually an entire chapter about suicide. And in this particular chapter, we work with a channel who channels Jesus. So in the channeling session, I ask him right at the beginning, is suicide planned before we're born? And he says it is never planned as a certainty, but it is planned as a possibility or a probability, or rarely a probability so high as to be almost certain. And then he says this was the case with the person who is the subject of the chapter, a young man named Cameron. Cameron suffered from severe depression and anxiety his entire life. And shortly after he graduated from high school, he hung himself from a rafter in his mother's home. His mother is the person I'm talking to for that chapter. Her name is Carolyn. Carolyn is the one who found him and actually had to cut the rope and take her son's body down. Cameron comes into the channeling session and he starts to describe what his experience was like as soon as he returned to the other side. And he says that as soon as he got back there, he saw his guides, which by the way is unusual because normally someone who suicides, if they're reached through a medium or a channel, they talk about how when they first get back to the other side, they're in what they call a gray zone. It's just gray all around them. And then after some passage of time in quotes here, then they move out of the gray zone and back into the light. But Cameron says he didn't have that experience. He sees his guides from the moment he crosses over. But he says, I was very bewildered and confused because that's the state I was in when I took my life. And so I didn't really understand what had happened. I didn't know that I had actually ended my life. And so he says that his guides showed him his dead body to get him to understand what he had done. And then from that point on, he talks about how he's had many, many dream state conversations with his mother. In other words, while she's asleep, she leaves the physical body and travels in her astral or spirit body back to the other side. And then they talk together about what had happened. And he says, I know you have no conscious recall of these conversations, but what I stressed to you in those conversations is that it was not your fault. You didn't fail me in any way. This was a choice I made, and I'm fully responsible for it. And that, by the way, is the most common statement somebody makes who has taken their life. When you reach them through a medium or channel, they say to their loved ones, it was not your fault. You did not fail me. It was my choice and my responsibility. Then Cameron goes on and he talks about what he's doing now. And he says his work is to help other teens who suicide to successfully adapt to life on the other side when they return. And then he steps aside and Jesus comes back in. And in this portion of the conversation with Jesus, he says something that to me is really the single most healing piece of information I've come across in all the years that I've been doing this work. He says that every suicide that was preventable by outside forces was indeed prevented. And he goes on to explain that what he means is if the suicidal person has the slightest openness or willingness to change their mind, Spirit knows about that and Spirit stages an intervention. The intervention can be almost anything. For example, somebody walks by and they smile at the suicidal person and then they feel better and they don't go through with it. Sometimes it's something very dramatic, like an angel taking human form and actually intervening. But Spirit knows and Spirit stages an intervention. So if someone, quote unquote, succeeds in taking their own life, that means there was no openness or willingness to change their mind, which in turn means that there was literally nothing a loved one could have done to prevent the suicide. So for anybody listening to this conversation, if you have lost a loved one to suicide and you feel some guilt or self-blame and think you should have done something to prevent it, there was literally nothing you could have done. So I would encourage you, take that guilt or self-blame and set it down and step away from it, because again, there was nothing that you could have done.
That is the best explanation I've ever heard of that. And it's very comforting. So thank you for that. Really helpful to me. Thank you.
And I think it will be helpful to many people.
Mm-hmm.
And then talking about Akashic Records. Can you explain what are Akashic Records?
The Akashic Record is the complete non-physical record of every word, thought, and action relevant to the earth plane, including the pre-birth planning. So for example, in my second book, Your Soul's Gift, one of the channels I work with is a woman in Michigan who channels an ascended master who uses the name Aaron, which was his name in his last physical lifetime. Aaron has access to the Akashic Record. So the person that I'm interviewing for the book, Aaron will go into that person's Akashic Record, and then he can find out exactly what they planned and why they made those plans. And I think this is the same method that a number of other non-physical beings are using when we talk to them in these sessions and they give us information about somebody's plan. This is actually a good way to find out what you planned before you were born. If you don't want to do hypnosis and you don't want to do a between lives regression, find somebody who can read the Akashic Records. There are many, many people who do it. You can find them by searching online. Have someone go into your record and they can find out what you planned and why you made those plans.
Favorite question, I think, on the list is, why do we incarnate and do we go to other planets?
Well, I think the other question first is to why do we incarnate? There are many, many answers to that question, but if you distill all of those answers down, there's a common denominator, which is that we are learning lessons in how to give and receive love. Now, again, there are many permutations of that lesson. In my workshop, I do something called the Divine Virtues Exercise. It is a list of virtues I've heard souls talking about in their pre-birth planning sessions. I think there's now 28 on the list. It's things like unconditional love, acceptance, patience, empathy, compassion, and so on. But when you distill all of the virtues down, the bottom line is giving and receiving love. That's why we're here. We do have incarnations, as I understand it, on many, many different physical planes and many, many non-physical planes as well. And it's not the case that you're just doing Earth until you graduate from the Earth School and then you go on to those other places. You have physical lifetimes on other planets and non-physical lifetimes in between earthly incarnations. So the average person has been all over the universe doing all sorts of different things.
That is remarkable. I love thinking about that. How would you define a soul versus a personality?
The soul, as I think of it, is a spark of God. It's a very small portion of God's God's energy. And then the personality, you could say, is a spark of the soul. It's a small portion of the soul's energy placed into a physical body.
And would you say that the personality would change depending on where you are in a different lifetime? Or do you always kind of have a spark of that personality with that soul?
There's a body of general literature called the Michael system. If people just Google the Michael system, you'll find a lot of information about it. Michael is a group consciousness, a collective that has channeled information about life plan relative to soul age and soul archetype. Soul archetype speaks to the question you just asked, because in the Michael system, and I'm not an expert on it, but I think there are 5 or 6 different archetypes. Some of them are king, priest, warrior. What archetype means is that there are a number of souls who have certain qualities or predominant traits that a priest would have, that a king would have, that a warrior would have. And you tend to carry those traits into every lifetime. So that's like the core of your personality, regardless of which lifetime it is. But then in the individual lifetimes, you wrap a set of personal traits around the core. And those personal traits differ quite a bit from lifetime to lifetime.
Are there different stages of the soul's evolution?
Well, this is also an area that the Michael system speaks to. According to Michael, I think in the Michael system, there are 6 categories of soul age that are incarnating on Earth. And it's something like infant, young, middle-aged, mature, and then old. There might be one other category that I'm forgetting. And you can tell to some extent which category a person is in, depending upon what they're doing with their life. So in other words, according to Michael, the youngest souls who just haven't been on Earth very much are interested in exploring survival on the physical plane. And then when you go up to the next category, young, according to Michael, those souls want to explore issues of power. And then when you get to mature and old, according to Michael, those souls are interested in psychology, emotions, relationships, spiritual things. So you have some general indicators as to how old a soul is. But then there are souls that are exceptions to those rules. You might, for example, have a mature or an old soul agree to be of service to another soul by playing a role that seems outwardly to be crude and primitive. But the reason they're taking on that role, the reason the soul asks them to take it on, is because they're advanced enough to be trusted to handle the role.
So much to know.
And so much to explore, which is really exciting. And then how would you explain the concept of oneness?
Oneness, to me, is our natural state when we're home on the other side. And what it means is that you're aware of the fact that there's actually only one being in the universe. And it's all of us. It's you, it's me, it's each. Each one of us is an individualized expression of the one. Now, here on Earth, for most people, this is just an intellectual concept, although there are people who have had oneness experiences. But as I understand it, when we're home in the non-physical, everybody is in a state of oneness consciousness. So the sorts of things that happen here on Earth where most people are in a state of perceived separation, attack, victim, victimizer, rescuer, those kinds of things, that's not happening on the other side because we're all in a state of oneness where nobody would attack anybody else.
I so wish we could remember that.
For those of us who may not be able to have a between lives regression with you, what would you suggest? I know the Akashic Records was one of the things that you said to explore, but are there other ways that we can try to remember or get in touch with that soul plan that we created before we came?
Yeah, there's actually a surprisingly large number of ways you can find out what you planned before you were born. I'm biased. I think that between lives regression is the most profound way, but other ways would be, again, the Michael system. There are people who channel Michael. You can talk to Michael directly yourself. Akashic record reading. Dream work is a great way to get an answer to any question. Before you go to bed at night, speak out loud your guidance souls. Ask one question. It might be, what is my life plan? Ask for a dream that answers the question. Ask that the dream be understandable. Ask for help remembering the dream, and then keep pen and paper or a digital recorder next to your bed. Write it down or describe it into the recorder if you wake up. Palmistry. Your life plan is encoded in your palm print, and there are people who know how to read that. Iridology. The life plan is encoded in the iris of the human eye. Chinese face reading. The life plan is encoded in the structure of your face, and the Chinese have figured out how to read that. Automatic writing. but you can Google the term. It's a way to train yourself to channel information from spirit. Meditation is a good way to get an answer to any question. At the start of the meditation, speak out loud to spirit, ask, what is my life plan? And then just let your mind go quiet and see what happens. It's not so much that you will hear your guides answer your question, although that could happen, but during the quiet times of the meditation, when your mind isn't thinking, that gives the guides an opportunity to plant a seed that can germinate days, weeks, or months down the road. So you will just suddenly come into a knowing of the question you asked sometime after the meditation. There's another body of general literature called the Human Design System, and a specific form of it called gene codes. Gene here is Gene. Trying to think if I've forgotten anything.
I think you just gave us 5 more episodes.
I agree. With some things I'd never heard of. So
oh, me neither.
I'm excited.
There's one more. There's a guy in the UK named Blue Marsden who has a system for determining your soul plan. I don't know the details of his system, but he's trained people to give soul plan readings, as he calls it. That's another option. Numerology is very good. I went down that path when I first started researching the books. I was amazed at the detail and the accuracy of the information that came from numerology. So there are many things that you can do.
Are there other spiritual resources that you use on a regular basis? Like I know you said that you had used numerology before and it was actually pretty accurate. Are there other types of practices that you have?
My main spiritual practices are prayer and meditation. I have been saying for years, I think prayer and meditation will get anybody 80% of where they want to go. And the other 20% will be something that's unique to you that you have to figure out on your own. But I think prayer and meditation are the most powerful spiritual technologies, if you want to use that term, that anybody can use.
Never heard that expression before. I love that.
And then are there any thoughts or wisdom that you can share about where we are right now in 2020?
My understanding of what's happening is that the Earth has already moved from the 3rd dimension into the 4th and is on its way to the 5th, which is a dimension of unity consciousness. So we're headed home, not in terms of leaving the physical body, but in terms of getting back into a state of unity consciousness. So the 4th dimension is at a higher vibration than the 3rd, and the 5th is at a higher vibration than the 4th. So as the Earth moves up in vibration, there's more light coming onto the planet, and the light has the effect of bringing up whatever darkness is here so that we can heal it, release it, and move on to the 5th dimension. And that's why it looks like things are actually getting worse. But in fact, it's just part of the process. And if you take a broader view, what's happening now is something that's actually good, even though it's difficult, because there's a lot of darkness that has to be healed in order to get to the 5th dimension.
It's a wonderful way to look at it.
I agree. That gives me a lot of hope.
And it's hope, right? It's hopeful. That's very uplifting.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll also share with you, I've asked specifically about President Trump in some of the channelings. And what Spirit said to me was that he trained for many, many lifetimes to play the role that he's playing now. He really prepared for this role and is doing it in service to us. Again, it's very unpleasant in some ways, but what he's doing is helping us to focus clearly on the choice. Do you want to have a love-based planet? Do you want to have a fear-based planet? Do you want spirit-based or do you want ego-based? He's bringing that choice into clear focus so that we can actually make the choice.
Wow, I think that's true.
I think that a lot of people need to hear that.
What's next on your list?
There is a new book that's in final edits now. Hopefully it will come out in the spring. It's about the pre-birth planning of different aspects of romantic relationships. And then because of the pandemic, I've moved my entire workshop online. So it's now possible to do the whole workshop without leaving your home. There are 4 components to it. I give a talk about pre-birth planning. We do the divine virtues exercise. And then there are 2 group hypnotic regressions, one to contact loved ones on the other side. And the other is a group between lives regression in which you can find out your life plan. So that's what the workshop is all about.
I was checking those out. I think the first one sold out really quickly, but
It
they
did.
were amazing. Well, this has been wonderful.
I'm so grateful. I mean, I've had to pinch myself the whole time. I refer back to your books, both of them, frequently. And they really do come up in conversations on a regular basis in my own life. So I'm just, thank you. Thank you. And thank you for explaining so much, even in more detail. to both Karen and I, and then to everybody watching and listening. I think for a lot of people, this will inspire them, whether it's read your books, do a workshop, or reach out and potentially do a session with you. I'm excited for them to learn more and explore more and dig into why they're here. That's why Karen and I are doing what we're doing, is because we know in our own lives, starting to figure out our own intention and our own plan has changed our own lives. And we want that for other people.
Well, and I want to thank you for the show that you're doing. You're bringing a lot of valuable information into the world. It's much needed. So thank you for doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you.
You can work with Rob. He offers between life regressions as well as spiritual guidance sessions and workshops that he spoke about. Visit yoursoulsplan.com for more information, and be sure to check out his books, Your Soul's Plan and Your Soul's Gift. They're life-changing reads.